So, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly, sponsored by SignalWire. This week joining us is Marian Marinov, Head of DevOps at Web Hosting Canada and a long-time user of open source platforms at large. I know you've been doing some voice over IP too, so it's going to be a very interesting chat. Thank you for joining us today, Marian.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So, first of all, would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself?
So I started with Linux in '96, and a year later I started as a system administrator. So generally I present myself as a sysadmin guy that's evolved to the manager position. Right now I'm head of DevOps at Web Hosting Canada, and I'm managing a few teams in the company.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I think well, of course, we try to keep ClueCon Weekly about open source, but not necessarily. But I think most of the tools that we've all used, actually, my first job was a junior sysadmin. I was still in university. And then I evolved into development. So I went a different direction, but I do remember that time. It was very fun. And yeah, so, well, DevOps and system administration, there's a lot there. What do you think the current landscape looks like? Is everybody finally using Kubernetes?
Oh, no, definitely not. But a lot of companies are joining the trend. I usually, when I'm asked about this, I usually tell customers that Kubernetes is not the answer for everything, because if your infrastructure is not ready for it, switching to it would only make the matters worse for your team and your infrastructure.
Yeah, it's just some people just want the brand name on it, and but it's not always useful. Right?
Generally, managers are reading the brochure and thinking, okay, this would solve all of our issues. And then a year or two later, oh, we shouldn't have done that.
Well, that's so. How did you get started? Like back in the day, how did things start, and how did they evolve?
I started with an 8-bit computer at home, playing games, and in Bulgaria we had this very nice set of books that would teach you programming without actually knowing that you are programming. So we were building games, and after that we switched at home to 16-bit computer, to 486, and at the 486 we got internet at home, and that was the funniest thing, because you would like this. I had the first hardware tunnel. So my ISP was in a different city, and at that time actually calling a different city was very expensive. So my father was working for a phone company, and he arranged a tunnel through the phone company. And the tunnel is, you call your local phone number in your local city, a modem picks up there and calls another modem in the other city. And in the other city, another modem is picking up and calling my ISP. When the connection is done, you're getting the signal from the other city.
Wow, I knew things like that existed, but I never actually heard of it.
Oh yeah, so I was around 7 at the time, so
wow.
I didn't understood anything about that, but now I love to tell this story. So after that, I started with Linux for internet, and learning a lot of Linux. At that time, we had to read all the menus because there wasn't anything else.
You remember Slackware? I got started with Slackware, which you do everything manually.
I'm still using Slackware on my PC daily and on my servers.
Well, I switched to Ubuntu a long time ago, but so you're still using Slackware?
Yes. I'm supporting Patrick for Slackware, and I'm loving the operating system.
Well, it's sure it is. So for a few people that don't know, Slackware is a very manual sort of distribution, I would say. It's all based around zip, tar archives. It's not really it's you have to know a lot to run it.
These days, not so much because of swag builds. A lot of the things are like you just download a file and wait for the thing to compile. But yes, a lot of the things had to be done manually. But what I love is that I don't break my machine with upgrades. While I tested Fedora and Ubuntu for a few years, and I really hated all of the upgrades. So I reverted back to Swagware.
Yeah, that's I mean that's I'm great. It's great to hear that many of those seminal Linux distributions are still around. I mean, Ubuntu did change a lot in the landscape because it really it you have to give it to them that they are who made Linux popular again after a short period of slump, etc. And but yeah, there was many other distributions doing a stellar job. Shout out to the friends at Debian, which we work with almost daily because it's the recommended distribution to install FreeSwitch on. To frankly, it runs on mostly anything else, but Debian is also great. I mean, there's huge
Yeah.
community and huge build. So yeah, so you started that. So what's your technological journey like? Are you still running physical servers? Are you doing most of your work on hyperscalers these days? What's the landscape and how has it evolved?
Okay, so you have to understand, as a huge geek, I run my own ISP in Bulgaria for yes,
Wow.
a handful of people, but
That's
I
some
do have,
hobby.
yeah, a hobby with 10 gigabit link.
Yeah, that's a nice
uh,
hobby.
I also keep like 30 or 40% of the mirrors in Bulgaria, so I do support these things. And then at home, I actually have one, two, three, four, five machines next to me that are physical machines on which I run a lot of experiments, and I do test and develop my open source software. So I do prefer hardware, but on those hardware machines, I run LXD containers. I love containers, and I have contributed significantly on the subject.
Wow.
And uh,
What in particular? Just curious.
um, mostly in the control group setup and the namespace setup in the kernel. I worked with some of the maintainers on the C groups and on the namespaces to provide more customizations, things that you generally in the beginning were not allowed to change in, for example, in the network namespace in a container, because you had to change them on the host and then restart your container to get the new value. I made those dynamic. Right now, I think maybe I don't remember which ones right now. It was a few
It's a
years
lot.
back. Which options?
Oh, I mean, it's always great to meet someone who has that much experience. I'm on the user side of things, of course. I contributed to the Ruby language, to some libraries. I managed a couple open source projects for a long time, but always been a developer. I always trust my my Docker setups to just work, and they usually do, to be fair. So
Uh,
it's absolutely fine.
I
And so,
generally didn't like Docker, so and I love
mhm.
Perl.
Oh,
So I wrote the Linux NS, Linux and Linux and Share functions for Perl, and still support those.
nice. Yeah, well, Docker itself, I mean, just containers. We all usually run Docker because it's easier, but the reality is that containers are a pretty standardized solution right now. It's just the way to go. Well, leads me into an interesting question and a consideration I was doing last few days, and I don't have an answer for this. But I want to throw it out there. I'm studying for the AWS Solutions Architect certification because I need to learn AWS and I end up having a lot of credit inherited from another project. And I really want to get a certification for that. But it feels like most of it is being superseded by containers and Kubernetes, like all of their software defined networking, all of their software defined storage, etc. You learn the AWS way, then you're stuck with AWS. If you learn even the Kubernetes way or the standard containerized way, then you can deploy those anywhere. I feel like the hyperscalers have a lot of technology that has been just, made obsolete by standard stuff like Kubernetes. You think that's the case? Like, is it still worth to learn a certification for a hyperscaler right now? Or is it just for large companies to bring their existing servers into the cloud, which is different than what we do?
So first, the important part here is if you want to go to AWS, GCP, or Azure, or
Of course,
even Alibaba, you need to learn their ways. That's the important part. Otherwise, you would still be trying to use them as a virtual machine provider, which they're not. The virtual machine is just part of their offering, but most of the times these suppliers have a lot of tools that would unlock different functionality that you didn't had available to you before. So if you are deciding to go to any of those specific cloud providers, you definitely need to know about not all, but at least some of the features that they provide you, so you can better leverage their ecosystem. Otherwise, you would be stuck in between, let's say, using an open source storage solution in their cloud environment when you could use, which is not optimized for their cloud environment, instead of using their optimized storage. So it is important if you have decided to go this way. If you haven't decided to go this way, having a standardized way of deploying would allow you to switch providers significantly easier. While if you stay with AWS way, you can have all of your provisioning, all of your infrastructure code specifically for AWS, and you would be locked in with AWS. While if you have created everything with Kubernetes, for example, or other software for this, you would be able to migrate your infrastructure from AWS to GCP to on-prem to whatever you want. However, there is one thing you won't be able to do, and that is leveraging distributed data center architecture that these providers have. Building your own distributed database infrastructure is a significant feat that not many teams in the world have the time to build.
Yeah, so at SignalWire we have some significant advances, and Ricardo, all of our stuff is multi-cloud and cross-cloud and distributed. But it's the work of a lifetime, right? It's been a lot of people working on it for a long time. It's not something you can just spin up right away. Yeah, I feel like you're right. So you need to know the ins and outs to really take advantage of them. Otherwise, you're just buying virtual machines from them. At that point, there are cheaper providers if you just want virtual machines, to be honest. Or even if you run your own, you can run your own Iron at this point. Are people even still buying machines and putting them in data centers?
I think yes. A lot of them actually. I live here in Canada now, and I found out that a lot of the data centers here generally provide co-location and not dedicated servers. So for me, that was a surprise coming from Europe and working with the States. I didn't have a data center that did not provide dedicated, and now I'm faced with a reality that is significantly different than what I'm used to.
Yeah, so you no longer just buy a rack and it's yours. It's completely different now.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, the Italian government recently, as in I think last few days, they launched a fully public cloud. They built for the government agencies only. Like it's a complete isolated data cloud they built on their own. I think it's more or less a cloud foundry type of thing. So it's not even bad. But I find it weird how much they spent. Like we went through the cost because those have to be public, right? So the same services will be in about half the price on Google, which is the most expensive hyperscaler out there. So the cost of building that private cloud was double what it will cost to run it on Google for like 10 years. So I don't know. People have to be careful.
We had the same problem in Bulgaria 2 years ago when the government did exactly the same thing, and it was extremely expensive. But in Bulgaria, it was due to corruption. It's not.
I think Italy is not that far away, so that's probably it's Europe, guys. For many people who watch the show are from the U.S. Europe is slightly different in that regard. Corruption is not that much of a problem. Yeah, this happens. It's kind of like part of the discussion here. It just happens. It's not good. So, well, I always ask this question: how if someone hears you speaking, they like our discussions, they like we're talking about systems and distributed systems and all the stuff. How I how do I get started if I am a young upstart to just out of high school?
Oh, I love this question because when I started, it was extremely hard. You actually had to buy the machines, the switches, and all of these costed a lot of money. And you couldn't simply say out, make a network of 8 machines and play with them. What you can do is on your own laptop, you just run a few virtual machines or a few containers and create the network you want and start experimenting. What I do suggest usually is you decide what you're going to work with. So if you want distributed systems, then get a list of software that is making distributed systems. Think about file systems, distributed execution. Think about distributed DNS, things like this. And at this point, you would be able to set up everything on your containers or VMs on your laptop, test everything there. The interesting thing that most people don't think about is that you're the sysadmin on your laptop, and as such, you can run your own DNS, and you can make your DNS think that it is the internet. So
Oh,
you can actually rewrite the dot. All the TODs can be under your control on your machine. So you can play with that within your infrastructure, and all of your containers and VMs would get the answers you need, and you can set up distributed file systems to see what will happen if you remove 1 or 2 VMs, lose all of your data a few times. And when you start with this, you would generally acquire a lot of knowledge that would just jumpstart the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. You start somewhere. I generally started with having the need of distributed web applications. So database replication was one of my main concerns.
oh yeah.
Then the file systems, and finally getting the requests. So there are different ways of achieving these things, but playing all of the time, playing on my computer or on my servers at home with this. And when I say servers, a lot of people are thinking 1U, 2U, 3U rack mountable machines. No, I mean a desktop machine that has enough storage and computing power to run your VMs. That's it.
Yeah, the also another simple thing that really helped me learn back in the time, which sounds silly, but it's also something I always recommend. Try setting up a Linux machine as your desktop machine and use it every day. Because when you have a problem, that's maybe not a business problem, but it's very relevant to you. Like you want to watch a movie and it doesn't play, then you go dig and learn how to it doesn't play. So now I see the video but I have no audio, so why is it? So I go look at the audio drivers, I learn about the kernel, I learn about the modules, and that's how you really get it going.
I would have agreed with you maybe 10 or 15 years ago,
Mhm.
but as you said, Ubuntu made things a lot easier. Now, my father is reinstalling his computer with Ubuntu, and it is significantly easier than on Windows. And you don't need drivers for the video because it does work out of the box. You don't need anything because most of the things, if not all of the things, they work out of the box. And yeah, I suggest that to people, but these days the Linux distributions are so easy
Oh
that
yeah.
this is becoming a problem for teaching. Unless they start with something like Slackware or Gentoo or FreeBSD, they're the distribution is providing everything for them.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. But still, there's sometimes things crop up, etc. Plus, you end up learning at least how the file system works, etc. You downloaded a file, now you don't know where it is. Going looking for it is still. I mean, there's a lot there. Granted, of course, it's easier. I mean, I remember I bricked a couple machines back in the time, like literally not starting anymore. And because if you remember the bootloaders thing, well, they're still there, but you don't see them anymore. Like Lilo and
Oh
all the
yeah,
other stuff. You could occasionally just break a machine completely, like dead.
I still use eLive for one of my laptops. It was easier to install than grep on it. But yeah, the interesting thing back in the day was if you needed to change anything on your kernel, like for my 486 machine, it took like between 12 and 16 hours to build the kernel. So if you have made 5 mistakes, this is a full week without your computer because you have to rebuild your kernel 5 times.
Yeah. So I a sad story. I once missed. I didn't even fail. I literally couldn't go to an exam and at university in something like 99 or whatever because my computer was completely bricked and I had no way to present my work. So I had to just go the following month because I literally couldn't go. Like, it was literally not working. Click, 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 nothing happens. Well, it's the way it's changed now. Well, so you mentioned you used to do some voice over AP. So I'm curious about what tools, what kind of voice over AP. These days you have other people managing it. You said, but it's always interesting.
So generally, I'm working in hosting companies, and we needed obviously phone support. So I knew Asterisk before, and I decided to set it up myself at SiteGround when we started with that. We just looked at other solutions at the time. They weren't so mature. So we built our own Asterisk solution for the company. We used it for IVR, we used it for authentication, we used it for outgoing calls, and for all of that we had to build a lot of statistics that were needed for the teams that were actually using that. So we were using a lot of the API, and around the API we built interfaces for making a call, closing a call. We redefined the CDRs so we can get better statistics. We used Postgres as databases for it, and these days I'm using Postgres with timescale to get even nicer graphs of what has happened. And generally, I'm using it as a normal VoIP system, nothing out of the ordinary. However, sometimes we need uh, strange things
Mhm.
like people being able to send codes over the voice over IP systems.
Oh,
So
that happens a lot.
yeah, that was an interesting thing for me. However, I did not personally did that. I actually outsourced it. These days, I generally have a person within the team or a company that would support this for me. But what I find very strange is that a lot of the sysadmins are reluctant or scared of Asterisk.
Oh yeah, well, there's no need to be scared of Asterisk or even FreeSwitch. They're interesting systems, and I mean, I did a lot of work with FreeSwitch. I literally grew up with FreeSwitch, and it was my tool for a very long time. Still is. I mean, I still work with the core FreeSwitch team. And I think learning telephony really drills home some of the networking concepts that you otherwise, you sort of miss out, because all the whole RTP thing, how packet loss works, how jitter works, it's different in the real time world of telephony as opposed to data transfer. Like if you're transferring 100 MB, there's a little bit of packet loss. You never know. Like the file will get there eventually, but packet loss in voice has a different meaning, and I feel like I feel like I know a lot that's not super common knowledge. I mean, everybody knows it.
I think that generally the problem is I also teach network security in Sofia University. So generally the basic things are very important for me. And I'm not scared of running a TCP dump on an interface. However, what I have seen is that a lot of the sysadmins, they are not understanding the output of TCP dump. They do not have a good understanding of how Wireshark works and how to use it for different protocols. And this is where a lot of the problems start, because people are tweaking options within Asterisk, which would probably not help them unless they know what the problem is and they need to dig into the data on the wire. And this is where TCP dump, Wireshark are very important to understand what's happening, right?
Oh yeah,
And
networking.
the basics of the networking, most system administrators don't get that. I have worked with a lot of system administrators, and either either they know networking well, or they simply know how to configure IP, and that's it.
Yeah, these days in the age of distributed systems and hyperscalers and all the other stuff, you probably need almost more networking than you need low level operating system knowledge, because that's taken care of by by containers, while networking is still there. Like you still have to know. And every time I help, so I'm a solutions architect, so I end up helping a lot of customers. I work with small and large alike, and I've helped some beginning developers, and their main problem with Docker in particular is not, well, almost never the software part. It's what's localhost now? Where if I'm looking at localhost, what does localhost mean? Because I'm inside a machine, which is inside another machine, which might be inside of another machine. So what's my actual IP, and how do I find out, etc. And I feel like that's actually a problem. Like that's the main hurdle. Like I see people, I can't connect to my database. Why? Because you're looking for localhost. Localhost for your web app is not the same thing, because they're different.
Uh,
I,
Interesting thing is that if you look at what the open source software has provided to that end, is a lot of abstractions. Like you have firewall D, you have UFD, you have CSF, and there were at least two or three other things like Shorewall or whatever, things to uh, remove the burden from configuring, for example, a firewall for the system administrator. Unfortunately, removing that burden created another burden, that is, we don't know what our firewall looks like because we are configuring this one particular string here,
Mhm.
and it translates to something. And now we want to create this additional specific NAT that is not allowed in this configuration.
Mhm.
And a lot of things break this way because you have your abstraction tool, and then you have one or more IP tables comments that may or may not execute in the proper order, and you are now looking at a firewall that is complete gibberish. You don't know what's inside of it.
Yeah, it is. It's right. Yeah, learning the basics at some point has to be done. That's why I always recommend people starting in SignalWire, starting in the engineering area, if they're usually very good developers or DevOps, but always there's a couple books like Understanding SIP, which is third edition right now. There's a couple university level books that you should really at least go through once. Like just flip the pages, absorb the terminology, learn the words, and when they come up in discussions, so you know what you're looking for. It's not a given for sure.
Uh, when I'm teaching new system administrators, I usually ask them to do one thing for the first 2 weeks, and that is go to the /bin/sbin directories and look at all the comments and just open the man pages for all of these comments. If the man page is huge, try at least the dash help to see what options these comments are providing to you, because what I'm seeing is that a lot of people simply don't know that comments that help for a specific thing exist. They don't know, because even though they have that as a standard on their distribution, they simply don't know how to use that at all.
Yeah, you're right. Again, it's always better to the first thing you should do is look at everything and learn the names and see what's there. Then you're right. Maybe you won't remember the exit option for that command to do whatever you need, but yeah, I think there's an option for whatever. Like for example, I recently used top to do a quick monitoring script for machines for testing for performance, which you take a snapshot with top, gives you the CPU and memory and whatnot, and just ship it off to some API. It's perfect for small scale monitoring. And I remember there was a way to just get one screen out of it instead of the persistent display it usually it has.
Yeah,
I didn't know what it was. Yeah. I didn't know what it was, but I remembered the option was there somewhere. So I just Googled it. Honestly, I didn't even go through the man page because it's really if you know what you're looking for, you will find it, even if you don't remember the details. I think it's worth saying for everything.
A lot of people are working like you. I am one level down. I generally prefer my sysadmins to know how the things work from the kernel side, so the proc file system. And this allows them to write scripts that are more efficient than actually reading the information from tools like, for example, netstat or top, because these are tools that provide a lot of information, but in order to provide you with that information, they're doing a lot of number crunching, a lot of analysis on the data. If you don't need all of that analysis and you just need specific things like, for example, the volt average or just the status information for a specific process, you don't need that tool. The information is already there in the proc file system. You just need to parse one or two lines and get all the information you need.
Yeah, of course, if it's something that's more professional, you need to go that route. Well, I mean, there's entire companies built around building easy to use sensors. They're based on the proc file system. Well, if you're just trying to determine if you're melting a video server, knowing what the CPU load looks like is enough. But you're right. Of course, there's better tools for everything, and that comes with learn. There's a lot of learning there, and it always helps. And I think one of the bad things, quotes, very very quotes, in using Docker and the containers is that we're a little bit losing touch of the real life operating system, right? You don't really know what's going on in your actual machine. Everything is an infinite resource in the cloud.
The other problem that I'm also seeing from the point of view of the hosting companies is that people are thinking, okay, I have these resources, but if your machine, virtual machine or container, lives on a machine with other containers may influence the performance of the hardware itself, and you would not get that same performance that you would get on another node. And this is generally a problem for software that is using around 80% of the machine, of the resources that are allocated there. There are systems like OpenVZ that generally allow a container to take all of the resources of one machine. Even though there are certain limits, not everything is limited, and one container can actually influence all other containers on the system. Uh, if you haven't properly configured the limits in Docker, for example, you have just left out the IO limits on all of your Docker configurations, all of your containers have all of the IO. However, if on one of your containers, for example, your database, you run a huge query, it would take all of the IO of the machine, and your web would not get enough IO to deliver that data that is required for your application.
Well, there's a lot in the IO space, and well, I would say used to be because I worked with the Ruby team at the time where Raptors were created and the whole new concurrency model. There's a lot to learn in non-blocking IO too, networking. There's so much that's new, and I think those concepts are not really spoken about university. Interestingly enough, like they don't come up. Some people are still teaching very old stuff. It's interesting.
For me, as a university lecturer, I think that these things are not taught in university because they're pretty niche. And so I had a distributed computing course only one semester because essentially students are not interested in that because this is not what they would be working with for a significant amount of time. When they are out of the university, the first thing they need is a job, and uh, they would not land a job with distributed systems out of the university. They would land a job as support sysadmin or developer, but they would not directly go to a job that actually needs that knowledge from a junior person. And yes, it is very hard at this position for the students. It's very hard. If they want to learn it, there are
Mhm.
not many courses that provide this information. If they learn it, there are not many places that would actually appreciate that they know that those things. For me at SiteGround, I I had been giving talks on distributed systems for years, at least
Mhm.
5 or 7 years before I actually needed one. Even though I was head of DevOps, I didn't need a distributed system within the company. So even though I was learning on the side, there was no need for the company, and a lot of companies don't need that. This is where the hyperscalers come and say, okay, here's your distributed file system, here is your CDN. All of all of that specific domain knowledge is provided by an API.
Yeah, here's again. I feel like some of that has been relevant for a short while, then it changed. But hyperscalers are still a good way to solve your problems if you're mainly about application development. They come with a cost though. Like if of
Yeah.
course if you could look at costs versus what it costs to set up your own stuff, they're really expensive. But hiring a full time sysadmin is not cheap either. So
Yeah.
there's that too. So there's a lot there. Well, Marian, thank you so much. It was a great chat. We went through a lot of topics, how to get started, how we all got started, what people should learn, how the landscape looks like right now. And it was really a pleasure chatting with you. And I hope I'll meet you at some conferences next year. Are you traveling to any conference next year?
We'll see. I don't know yet.
Mhm.
For now, I have no plans, but yes, we may see each other on some of the conferences.
Maybe IT Expo, maybe ClueCon, who knows?
We'll
ClueCon is
see.
back in August this year. So if you'd like to join us, we'd be super happy to see you there. Well, again, thank you so much, Marian Marinov, head of DevOps of Web Hosting Canada, for joining us today. And for the rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.